All right, let's move on to the next layer of the integumentary system, or the next layer rather, of the cutaneous membrane, and that is to look at the dermis. Here we'll look at what the dermis does, what are the major layers and cell types, what causes stretch marks, what are cleavage lines, what do tattoos have to do with the dermis, and what are blisters and calluses, what causes those. Let me take myself off here a second. In this real simple diagram, I wanted to show you this because it does show you the two major layers or regions of the dermis. You see listed here the papillary layer, and they're showing it as about this much. It's roughly a third of the dermal layer, and the reticular layer is the bottom two-thirds. This picture is not the best, but even here you can perhaps see how the reticular layer has got a lot more quote-unquote lines in it than the papillary layer does. You'll also notice there's some receptors up here that we'll get to in a moment. And just to make sure we're clear, the purple part they're showing us right here, this represents what layer? Hopefully you recognize this is the epidermis. So you can get an idea of just the difference in how thin the epidermis is. It's about the size of a sheet of paper, or the thickness of a sheet of paper rather, where you can see how the dermis is going to be a much thicker layer overall. This picture gets a little more detailed and gives us a little better, more realistic look at the dermis itself. Once again, let's establish what we're looking at here. What we're seeing here represents, again, the epidermis, okay, this top part. And they're trying to show over here where it's sort of peeled away so you can get a better idea. You can hopefully still see the layers. It's not drawn really well on here, but the papillary layer is going to be roughly about this much. This will be, again, the papillary layer, and the reticular layer is really most everything else. And again, you can see the size difference. Let's recognize what's here, and then we'll get into what the dermis actually does and in terms of its roles. The papillary layer, you should recognize, has some blood supply to it. It has some lymphatic tissue. We've not really discussed the lymphatic system yet. We'll get to that very soon. And hopefully you recognize, here, for example, here and here and here, we're looking at, and here's another one, we're looking at quite a few receptors. So we talked about the skin having a role in receiving stimuli or perceiving stimuli. This is how it's done in part because the papillary layer has some sensory neurons. The papillary layer also has a lot of loose connective tissue, a lot of areolar connective tissue. It is going to have these finger-like projections. Let me erase this. You see these projections here sticking up. These are called papillae, dermal papillae. And some of these are actually going to have things in them, like this one has a Meissner's corpuscle. This is going to be a touch receptor. So some of these bumps, if you will, of the papillary layer of the dermis are going to have receptors in them. Some may have temperature receptors, for example, and other kinds of receptors. You don't see it really well on this. They didn't try to draw it for this purpose. But if you were to strip away the epidermis, you might see certain patterns to the papillae, and those patterns help form the ridges that we associate with our friction ridges. When you look at your palms or the soles of your feet or your fingers or toes, you'll see there's little lines on those. I know you know those as fingerprints for your fingers. The fingerprints are formed in part because of the dermal papillae. They are genetically unique. You're the only one who has that particular pattern of lines and shapes and islands and whorls and grooves and little pieces to your fingerprints. So they are unique, and therefore they are used forensically for identification of bodies and crime scenes to identify suspects. So that's related to the papillary layer of the dermis. The reticular layer, you see, is a lot busier. We have, again, the blood supply coming in. A Pacchian corpuscle here is going to be a pressure receptor. We have the eccrine sweat glands. If you follow these, it's a little hard to see this one, but it follows all the way up here to the pore. That's where, and here's some more you can see over here a little easier. These are going to follow all the way up here, and that's where the sweat is going to come out through the pores. But the glands themselves are in the dermal layer. You have erector pili muscles. These are muscles that actually can make our hair move, make our hair stand up on end. They pull, so when your hair's up on its end, it's because our small little muscles actually did that. We also see these. These are going to be sebaceous glands. These glands are going to be producing an oil that helps protect the hair, that lubricates the hair to keep it intact. And of course, an ample blood supply. You see the blood vessels coming in here. And again, the blood will actually come up here as far as and get up to and stop at the papillary layer. We said before, the epidermis is not going to have a blood supply to it, and it's going to depend on diffusion to get its stuff. Just as a reminder, we start with this layer heading down. Here it represents, again, the hypodermis. Oh, here it is up here. The hypodermis, the superficial fascia, does actually help connect the dermis to the underlying tissue. So again, recognize the papillary layer, and its major roles is to support the dermis, to support the epidermis with some basic blood supply. It also has some receptors to it. The reticular layer, though, is far more about all the other structures, and we didn't get into this much in detail yet, and it's a little hard to see here, but better to see back on the other one. Oops. We see again all of the fibers. The reticular layer is going to be far heavier in the collagen and elastic fibers. That's going to give that tissue much more support. So when we look at the major cell types we find in the dermis, we find fibroblasts, macrophages, and adipocytes. Fibroblasts are going to be cells that produce more fibers, and the major fiber types, the major protein types, are elastin and collagen, and they have different roles, and we'll get to those in a second. Macrophages are going to be defensive cells, cells that are trying to protect us from foreign invaders, and adipocytes are going to be fat storage cells. So all of these cell types are going to be very important in the dermis. But again, to come back to one of the major roles of the dermis is to provide us that important strength as well as elasticity of our skin. Collagen is a very strong protein. It's going to give us a lot of strength and tension, if you will, on our skin. The elastin gives it some flexibility. Recall that they do look different. Collagen's like thick cables, elastins like a thinner net-like or web-like protein. So you see the differences in anatomy and physiology here. Collagen gives you strength. Elastin is going to give you some elasticity or flexibility. There's also going to be an extrafibrillar matrix, which is just the supporting tissue that we associate with ground tissue to support the elastin and collagen. So dermal physiology, and this kind of touches back on what I just mentioned. I forgot I had the slide. Dermal physiology, let me come back for a second. Dermal physiology is going to be mainly about the collagen and elastin giving the skin its strength and its flexibility. You want to be able to move and have your skin move, but also have a recoiling. You don't want skin just to hang around and lay after you've moved one direction. Another piece of this skin, what's called skin turgor, is high water content. There's a lot of water in our dermal layers, and that you can actually detect this with this pinching skin test. If you pinch the back of someone's hand and you still get this peak of tissue, that is, it doesn't go back down too well, that shows that person's probably dehydrated. One other thing we can associate with the dermis, or a couple other things. One that you don't know heard of is stretch marks. These are called striae. What are stretch marks? Stretch marks are when the dermis has been stretched really beyond its ability to recoil. We see this a lot in pregnant women. Most women end up with stretch marks. We also see this in those who've gained a lot of weight. If they've been obese, they've gained a lot of weight over a period of time, and when they lose that weight, then the skin can't just naturally recoil back. It's sort of been overstretched. The dermis, in effect, has been torn in these areas, and its ability to recover is somewhat limited. There are some controversial products out there that claim to reduce stretch marks, certain vitamin therapies, and they're not really, it's not a very proven science behind ways that can 100% either prevent stretch marks or repair them. Stretch marks don't have any sort of pathologic value. They're not harmful. It just indicates that the skin got overstretched and its ability to recoil is limited. I do want to mention one other component about collagen and elastin, and that deals with something called cleavage lines. If you look very carefully at the dermis, the collagen and the elastin are going to run in parallel directions in many cases in different parts of the dermis. These parallel lines you see here, let me draw some for you. These parallel lines that we associate with the collagen and elastin are called cleavage lines. This is significant, especially when we're talking about surgery, because if a surgeon actually were to cut across, here are the cleavage lines here. If they were to cut across and make an incision across that, it's going to result in probably scar formation because the collagen and the elastin fibers really can't connect quite the same way at quite fast enough a rate to avoid a scar being formed. However, incisions that are made parallel to the cleavage lines tend to form much more quickly and result in less scarring. And finally, let's chat about tattoos. Well, almost finally. What is a tattoo? A tattoo is actually an injury to the skin where a needle is put in just past the epidermal layer and injects ink. This ink will eventually bind. It's actually more of an immune system reaction, but eventually it will bind with tissues in the dermis and it will lock in place. And that's why tattoos are relatively permanent, because if it was put onto the epidermis, of course, it'd be shed as the keratinocytes were shed. But if it's actually put into the dermis, then it's going to last a lot longer. So when you're looking at a tattoo, what you're actually seeing is the pigment that's actually in the dermis. So you see a tattoo on somebody's skin, you're kind of looking through their epidermis to their dermis. I'm asked a lot by people, are tattoos safe? And the tattoo process can be done very safely, can be done in a very hygienic way. One of the concerns about tattoos is, though, that there really isn't a regulation of the industry. The FDA doesn't regulate tattoos. So, yes, there are some inks that are great. However, there really isn't a process by the FDA evaluating inks to determine if they're safe. So that has led some tattoo artists to actually use some non-safe inks, including things like industrial paints and printers and automobile paint. Hopefully, if you have a tattoo, this does not apply to you, but it does bring up a concern that the tattoo industry doesn't have a lot of regulation on it, except for the hygiene part. The tattoos, that what's going into your body itself, actually is less regulated. Can tattoos be removed? Yes, there are some procedures that can do it with different levels of success. The most popular one is laser therapy, which actually breaks up the ink, shoots a laser through, breaks up the ink, and eventually your body absorbs the ink and it's processed. There's a procedure called salivation where you actually use salt to try to do the same thing. So there are some ways potentially of removing a tattoo if you don't want it. After a while, do be prepared to pay a lot for it, depending on how elaborate the tattoo is. It could be a few $100s to $10,000 or more to have a tattoo removed. Finally, a couple other issues related to the dermis we should mention: a blister and a callus. A blister is when when usually because of friction, although it can be because of chemicals or burns or other causes, but let's focus on friction for a second. If there's friction on the skin, it can cause some fluid to accumulate between the epidermis and the dermis. And this fluid is usually sera, basically plasma, relatively clear, and it will kind of bubble up, if you will. The outer layer of a blister, when we're talking about this outermost part of the blister, that actually is epidermis, and then the fluid that's in there is going to be a serum. Can be blood. You can have a blood blister. You can get blood accumulating in that. You also can get pus, which is showing that there's a bacteria or there's an infection going on, or white blood cells are involved, and you're accumulating pus. So a blister is usually caused by friction or other forces, which can cause a separation of the epidermis and the dermis. A callus is more of a long-term, quote-unquote, injury, because in this case you may have, again, friction on the skin, but the body responds by well, because of this kind of force, it may respond by increasing the cell production in an area local to that, in fact, that local area of friction. So you may develop a thick layer of that. The callus is a thick layer of the stratum corneum. So you still have your stratum vistale, you have your spinosum, granulosum, and lucidum, but you, instead of having 25 or 30 layers of cells that make up your stratum corneum, you could have twice that. And you get this thick, hardened mass of cells, and that's what makes up the callus. There are some products that actually can remove the callus. Basically, they are all going to be products that actually damage or reduce the keratin levels and will eventually try to get your skin soft and smooth again. You also can, there's different dermabrasion techniques to soften that skin back up again, to remove the dead layers of skin. But again, it's actually a result of a prolonged source of friction that causes a callus. So that takes us through the end of the dermis. We will then pick up with a couple other issues related to the integument, including burns and skin cancer and some other skin pathologies in our next videos.